our speaker tonight, and welcome you on behalf of the yearly meeting, Quakers. I would just like to tell you a little bit about the context of why we have these lectures, and a bit about Quakers and their beliefs. The foundation of Quaker belief is that there is that of God in everyone, or the spirit in all people, and their belief drives us to act in the world for peace, justice, and equality. In terms of Jane's lecture tonight, it links to the themes of our Quaker beliefs around integrity, community, equality, and sustainability. I would now like to welcome you all on behalf of our yearly meeting. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou, e hui hui mai nei. Mo tēnei hui o tēnei tau, o te hāhi tūhauiri. Ka hui hui mātou i a te rohe o Ngāti Toa, Mua Upoko, Ngāti Raukawa. Te hui kaupeka o Kapiti Hoki, tēnā koutou e hoa mā. Ngā mihi nui ki tā mātou manuhiri tuaranga, tā mātou manuhiri rongo nui. Ki tā mātou hui o te tau, Jane Kelsey. Ka kōrero a ia a kua nei ki te kaupapa o te hikoi, ki he autika, mō ngā tangata katoa, te ao hurihuri, te ao hau, me whakakaha, me whakau, ngā ture te mana whakahaere, o ngā kaipakahi o te ao. Me he mea ka murua ngā hara, o ngā kaipakahi me ngā kawanatanga, hei pure tumu i ngā māmaitanga. Greetings to you all who are gathered here at this annual meeting of Quakers. We are meeting in the traditional area of Ngāti Toa, Muaupoko, and Ngāti Raukawa, and in more recent years, the monthly Kapiti Quaker meeting. Greetings to our first-time visitors, and to our esteemed and famous guest to our annual meeting, Jane Kelsey. She will be speaking soon on the hikoi, the transformational journey from neoliberalism to a fairer world for all, by strengthening, by firming up the laws and leadership and governance of the businesses of the world, restorative justice and fair deals by both businesses and governments seeking long-lasting solutions. And so I welcome you all tonight, and I welcome Jane Kelsey. Thank you.
We've got all bones.
It's my trouble.
Kia ora koutou, mihi nui kia koutou, ki ngā tangata whenua o tēnei wā, tēnā koutou, e ngā iwi o ngā haiwha, tēnā koutou. Very nice to see some old friendly faces and some new faces, and to meet with a new community of Quakers. I have a very old friends, two very old friends in Auckland who I know were stalwarts of the Quaker community there. Jack and Mary Woodward, who have been great friends and allies in many battles we had in the university, as well as on many marches. And sadly Mary has passed on, but there is another Mary Woodward now. And Jack is still doing his thing. He was on the last march. I was asked if I would say a little something to introduce myself and how I fit with the story I'm going to tell today. And I thought the most helpful thing would probably be to introduce you to my parents. My father was a boy from the Hokianga. He was from a very poor family. They moved to Auckland when he was about 9, during the Depression. No, just before the Depression. And his father got a job as a greenkeeper. And then his mother and father divorced, which was a very unusual thing in those days. And so my father left school at 14, got a job as a barrow boy at Turners and Growers, rented a garage for himself and his mum, and taught himself Shakespeare. And over time, he went to work for the Government Tourist Bureau, and he finished as the Director of Tourism. And he was a true public servant. He believed that what you did if you worked for the government was that you worked for the people. And that was one of the fundamentals that he instilled in me. Many of the conversations that we had over the dinner table, and the belief that if you had that role, you had responsibilities that went with that role. So that was my father, who died in 1986, right at the time when the State-Owned Enterprises Act was going through the Parliament. And I remember him saying, he had a brain tumour and he was only sick for about 10 weeks. And he said, I don't understand why they're saying these things about us. And in a way, I was really pleased that he wasn't there to see what happened later. Because I think for many of his generation, it was soul-destroying. And on the other hand, I wish that he was still around so that he could talk to some of today's young people working in those ministries who are stuck with their KPIs and who jump through all these jargon-ridden hoops about what being a public servant means. So that's my dad. My mum was born in Pātea, staunch National Party stock, went to Wellington, did a bit of work in a few businesses. Then when the war came, she enlisted, and she enlisted as what was known as a VAD, which was a nurse. She was on the hospital ship, she was in the hospital in Egypt, and spent 4.5 years at the war. And then came back as quite an independent woman in her late 20s, and then got married to my father and then became a domestic servant. As he moved around on diplomatic posts. So she was mother to a group of younger people working for the New Zealand government. But she was always fiercely independent, and I remember battles she had with my father about the right to have a signature on the checkbook. And she died at the end of October last year, 3 days short of her 99th birthday. Oh. So we had the funeral on her birthday with some red wine, which she was partial to, and sang a happy birthday. And then we found this note that she had written to one of her great nieces who must have had a school project saying, find someone who was at the war. And I hadn't actually seen this before. And she said it was about the futility of war, about how they were manipulated, how they were lied to. So for her, we used to go to Anzac Day every year, including up until the year before she died. And for her, it was about remembering the others who were there with her. It wasn't about what we now see as the glorification of war and the rebirth of militarization in our culture. And so that's a bit of where what I bring to this topic and the stuff I do as a university academic and public intellectual comes from. I suppose the last thing I want to say is, like most people in this room, I'm old. We have fought many battles over the decades, and we have some accumulated wisdom over that time, but we also are not the ones who are going to have to bear the burden for the future. And part of the challenge of being in our later periods of work and life is to create the spaces and the support systems for those who are coming through in times that are more difficult than they were when we were doing that work. I mean, we just had Muldoon to deal with. The challenges that confront the new generations now are much more difficult. And I think we need to, as I will say at the end of my lecture, find ways to support them, but to recognise that it's their voices that are the ones that are now going to have to be heard as they shape their future. So, I really do have a bad back, so excuse me if I kind of wiggle around a bit. I spend much more time than I would like these days offshore. And that's been a case, I suppose, for about the last 15 years, but especially for the last decade. And it always gives you a perspective on what's happening here when you are seeing what's happening elsewhere and what's being talked about elsewhere. And there is no doubt, especially in the last decade, that we live in a world in turmoil. Absolute turmoil. For poorer countries, that's been the case for a lot longer. But we don't kind of pay much attention to them because that's an endemic, enduring reality that we prefer isn't there. We don't have to worry about. The shock that came with the global financial crisis was that it brought it home to roost. You could have a collapse in the centre of what complacently was considered the developed world. And that collapse brought out some spontaneous talking of truth to power. We had the Occupy movement. Incredibly influential in its own way, spontaneous, anarchic. It wasn't organised by the old political parties who thought they were going to be the fulcrum of the revolution. It was young people predominantly saying, this is not our future. Then we had, in addition to the turmoil in the US, I spent some time in Iceland. Now, Iceland, of course, is smaller than we are, has many similar features to us, very easily captured as it was. And for them it was a massive shock. Huge debts, huge distrust of those who held power, real questions about how they were going to get out of this. Indeed, they had a political transformation where the government that took over was Greens and left. They set about redistribution, consciously minimising the price that was paid by the most vulnerable, reducing the debts of the most vulnerable, with the IMF putting in place capital controls, which had been considered to be anathema, and they restabilised. And then when I went back there a couple of years later, lo and behold, the old guard had been re-elected. And we had lots of discussions about why that was. And they said it's because we blamed the individuals, we put a few of them on show trial, and we never had a discussion about the systemic problems of the economy and the intimacy between the state and the corporate elites. And because we never addressed those systemic features, those who had set up the structures were able to reoccupy them. And then when I went to Greece, and we had similar discussions in Greece, and it had looked like things were really going to change there. And then they kind of didn't. I've just come back from Latin America. I just spent 3.5 weeks in Argentina and Uruguay and Brazil and Cuba. And both Argentina and Brazil now have right-wing governments back in, as do a lot of the other Latin American countries. There was a swing back. Indeed, there was a protest when I was in Brazil, yes it was. It was in Sao Paulo, about needing a military dictatorship. Now, why am I telling these anecdotes? What we're seeing now, in my view, are the morbid symptoms of an economic system and a regime that supports it that we call neoliberalism, that is imploding in on itself. The lack of values, the greed, the accumulation of wealth, the inequalities, the systemic denial of democratic governance and the right of people to have any say in their future is not a sustainable model. And we're seeing morbid symptoms of that all over the place. But there is no alternative framework there that people can grasp as a foundation for something different. And so I often refer to this in terms of an old Italian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, who was imprisoned by Mussolini, and he wrote some very cryptic prison notebooks in the 1920s. And he then was, of course, looking at a different paradigm collapse, looking at the collapse of the laissez-faire era, and the hands-off regulatory regimes that also let the money men rule. And the fact that you had, on the one hand, progressive responses as they were seen at the time, of more socialist kind of responses, or social democratic parties, Labour parties and so on emerging, and you had fascism. And so at a time of destabilised paradigm, he said, we're in an interregnum. The old is dying, the new is yet to be born. We don't know what the new is going to look like. It could be repressive, regressive, as he was living through under Mussolini. It could be progressive. He said, we have to make that future. It doesn't make itself. And in my mind, what we're seeing with some of the regressive responses around the world at present, and some of the more progressive voices, is this battle being played out. And it's a battle that is underpinned, to bring the Quaker values into this, by a battle over integrity, over truth, over community and solidarity and values of sustainability and social justice as a foundation for a post-neoliberal era. But it won't just happen. Now that's what I see around the world when I'm travelling. And then I come home and it's like we're in a cocoon. You know, sometimes I wonder whether we think that we're actually on the same planet as some of these other developments. I mean, you look at Brexit and you look at the election of Trump, and all the media wanted to ask was, what happens to the free trade agreements? There was no analysis of what was happening and why, and what it actually meant for us here. And so, when I've looked at some of the international literature that's been analysing what's been happening in the more global sense, even some of the institutions and cheerleaders of the last 4 decades have seen the writing on the wall. Hello, Prue.
She sings someone she knows.
And we now have the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO and others talking about the need for an inclusive form of capitalism, which is old wine in new bottles, but at least they're realising that they've got a problem. And we've got the IMF producing fascinating research papers talking about how the model has failed. And New Zealand is the poster child in many of those papers. And they talk about the affluent world being in a state of denial. Well, we are the ultimate state of denial. And so, when I was preparing this lecture, I said, okay, I'm going to sit and keep a log of the newspaper stories in a month leading up to when I was, my 3rd deadline for writing the book. And that it'll be familiar to all of you, but especially for those of us who live in Auckland. I mean, we have a dysfunctional economy, infrastructure, society, and it's now, when I wrote the book that I'm going to talk about in a moment, The Fire Economy, I mean, I could see all these dysfunctions, but 2 years later, I mean, not even the government is denying that we have a housing crisis and a bubble.
that we have homelessness that is an issue, that we have problems with the infrastructure, that the roading system is in a state of perpetual crisis, but also the various natural catastrophes that we've had show that our sewage and our water systems and so on are really problematic. We have environmental sustainability problems with our waterways. We have the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, even the very mildly worded report from the Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister, saying that, yes, maybe we have some problems here. Then we have this revising of how we define swimmable waters. And then we have these issues about migrant workers and the exploitation of migrant workers who are brought here to not just do the cheap work, usually on illegal terms of employment, certainly in the Hort sector, but also to push down wages of those who are in the legit workforce. And then we have this debate about immigration. And the debate about immigration is not actually about the rich people who are coming and buying the properties and clogging up the Auckland motorways. Who are the ones who's the backlash, who bear the backlash? It's actually the ones who are the most vulnerable immigrants, the ones we can close the tap off most easily. Now, that's just part of the log in this month. But there's no coherence drawn between all of those factors. There is no underlying narrative about what is it that gives us those symptoms. So the solutions are all piecemeal solutions, one-on-one for each of those policies. And part of the reason, of course, is that we have institutionalised beneficiaries of that system who not only National but Labour don't want to scare off. And we have those who voice I call them the fire alarms. Those who are the ones who, when we seek to deviate from the path of the last 4 years, will say there is going to be a crisis in investor confidence. We're going to have a credit rating downgrade. You can't possibly do this. So we have the fire alarms that are ready to ring. Now I'm going to unpack that a bit more in a moment, but the point that I want to make, going back to what I was talking about with the US and the US global financial crisis, the debt crisis in Europe, the meltdown in Iceland. If even the IMF researchers say that we are heading for a cliff, that this is not sustainable, what happens when we hit that cliff? If we don't have an alternative framework, then we have the Pavlovian response of more austerity, and we dig ourselves deeper into a failed model. And so we need to have the debate before we hit the cliff, not after we're there, especially because we know internationally that those who suffer in a crisis are not the rich. They're the ones that get the bailouts, the corporate welfare, safety nets in this country to protect the most vulnerable. And so we actually don't have a choice if we believe in the kind of ethics and values that the Quakers believe in, or the kind that my father brought me up with. We don't have a choice, but we also don't have a clear pathway. Now, the book that I wrote a couple of years ago was called The Fire Economy, New Zealand's Reckoning. FIRE. It stands for Finance, Insurance and Real Estate. We have an economy where the way you get rich, the path to wealth, is through finance, insurance and real estate. In the old days, for us, a couple of notable exceptions, we had a mixture of an oligopoly. We had the Fletchers and the Carters and the big players. We had quite a lot of small businesses who did things, made things, also had shops or supermarket. We had butchers and bakers and greengrocers. And we had state enterprises, which were multifunctional. They weren't just there to be efficient. And they all had, for all their faults, I was very critical of Fletcher's during that period and of some of the state activities. For all their faults, they had a longer term vision. They invested for the future. They had a workforce and they had tense relationships with the unions quite often, but they had a workforce that was reasonably stable and that had a set of mutual beneficial relationships. 1984, when we had the Autonomic Revolution, one of the first things that happened, I talk about this in the book, I'm not going to talk about it much here. The first things that were changed related to finance. And my dear old friend Bruce Jesson, when he wrote his last book just before he died, Only Their Purpose is Mad, subtitled it The Money Men Take Over New Zealand. Now, those of us who remember the 1980s and all the heydays of the Brierley's investments and the Chase Corporation and all of those leading up to the 1987 stock market crash. What did we see on the news? And who'd ever seen this share market on the news before? And there was this incredible excitement. And everyone thought, this is the way you get rich. And so we put lots of money, well, I didn't, but lots of people put lots of money in there, and it all went up in a puff of smoke. But what had happened during that period was that we'd had a transformation not just in how we thought about the economy and how you made wealth and so on. And we celebrated those who lit their cigars with $10 notes. It was before the plastic $10. We had the beginnings of that gap, but we actually celebrated the wealth. These were the clever people. They knew how to make money quick. But we also started to have a transformation in the old productive economy. Who wants to put money in long-term investments that might take 15, 20 years to deliver returns when you can whiz them into the share market and get this money back? And the banks, of course, wanted to lend into that. Or was the Bank of New Zealand banking crisis. And that was, of course, run by Ron Brierley. But we also had a change in psychology and a change in the values of how business operated. We moved to what was called shareholder capitalism. That you no longer looked at the long-term ownership, that the shareholders had a right to have immediate returns for their investment. And how did you get immediate returns? Well, you didn't do the long-term investment. You, especially with privatised telecom, you took the money out, you didn't reinvest in the infrastructure, and over a period of time, we had a really important shift in the culture of our economy, accompanied by a shift in the way the state facilitated that. And so we get into the 1990s and we have the national government, the labour market deregulation, more privatisations, the redistribution of wealth through the mother of all budgets. Very interesting series on Radio New Zealand now with the Ninth Floor, hearing reflections on that. Jenny Shipley's one I'm going to be using to show my students. But not only did we have an inequality emerging from this, but we had a very shallow, hollowed out economy. And that had two features. Not only did you keep investing in financial markets or investing in property, but we also had this growing income and wealth gap. And one of the things that became especially significant from the later 1990s, and you can see in my paper, I've got lots of graphs there. I'm not going to do the graph stuff with you, but they show how this panned out. If you have an economic recovery and you have a shallow economy, how do you get people spending to boost a consumer-driven economy? You do it through debt. What we did was we privatised public debt and moved that debt into the private sector. It was part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act process, but we moved the debt, and this is one of the issues that the IMF economists keep raising, not the ones who do their survey with Treasury, but the researchers. Over a period of time, especially during the Clark Labor government, levels of debt of households increased massively. At a time the economy was in the golden weather. Well, actually the golden weather was sustained by increasingly high levels of private debt. And that borrowing was largely and increasingly to invest, especially after the dot-com bubble burst, in the property market. And if you talk to people now about how do you make money, they don't say you get a good job. They say you buy property. And if you look not just at the rising levels of household debt, but the levels of debt that are in real estate, as opposed to the level of investment in real production, which has remained flat, that indebtedness we have is that property bubble, which is fine as long as it keeps going. But very interesting figures out the other day from MBI, Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, because they got permission in 2012 to start doing a housing affordability index, and we only got the first figures last week. And they set a threshold from 2013 about housing affordability, and they measured them in different parts of the country, and we have between 60 and 90% of the population falling below that threshold of affordability. Now, that's a problem when it comes to household debt and housing debt. And it's a real problem if you have overburdened households about what happens when interest rates rise, what happens if there's an employment downturn, what happens if there's a scare around property values and they suddenly plummet. And we have a whole lot of distressed debt, and we have a whole lot of negative equity. People owe more on their houses than they're worth. And the banks and the banks predominantly lend on housing mortgages. That's their money. I mean, they make lots of money and they've got lots of incentives to keep pushing it out there. So our housing bubble fuels the Australian banks' ever increasing profits. So what happens? And this is a question that no political party at present wants to confront. You might remember that Materia Ture, I think it was last year, said something about it would be a good thing if property values fell.
She did say that.
I'm not sure that she actually had a plan behind it. That's the problem. But it's not just households, the rural sector. Debt in the rural sector is also massive, and you can see that from the graphs. And the vast bulk of it is to dairy farmers, for conversions, and for the massive increase in the value of dairy farms as they chase after white gold, milk powder. And we see the consequences of that in the fact that when the dairy price fell, there was a huge amount of distressed debt amongst the most indebted of the dairy farmers. And again, concerns in the Reserve Bank about what that might mean for the banks that had lent to them. But we also know that a lot of conversions mean a lot of marginal land being converted to dairy, which not only means a lot of money, but it means a lot of fertiliser, and it means a lot of water, and it creates the additional problems that we see in terms of waterways and environment. And we know the more cows we have, the more emissions we have, and the only economic planning that I can see from the current government is that we need to double dairy exports by 2030. But our dairy exports, and you'll see this again in the graphs, are largely low value added milk powder. Now, this is a problem when planning is anathema to economic policy and strategies. But the rural sector has been on a high for quite a long period of time until this little dip. And of course, built around the Chinese market. And again, there's a graph there that shows how massive our increases of exports to the Chinese market have been. And I explain why that is not about the China-New Zealand FTA. But it means we're hugely vulnerable. This is a market which is actually looking for things other than low value added milk powder. It's sourcing some of that from other places, but it's also looking at doing added value of its own, and looking at buying the dairy supply chain so it has a guarantee of supply into China. Now, there are serious questions about whether economically that's sustainable, whether we really want to keep increasing foreign ownership, not just by China in our agricultural sector, but whether we want to continue this very fragile dependence on a single export commodity, and have the debt that is loaded onto that. The OECD is not a radical body any more than the World Bank or the IMF is. But they put out a really interesting study in 2017, which was the Environmental Performance Review of New Zealand's growth model. And they noted that our growth model is based on export of primary products, which they said was approaching its environmental limits. They noted that over half the greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, the highest share in the OECD, and that was exempted from the emissions trading scheme. They noted, and this is quotes, that pollution of fresh water is spreading over a wider area, the country's biodiversity is under threat, and if New Zealand GDP took account of environmental costs, the economy would actually be shrinking. That's the OECD. So if we have the problems with finance, the problems with real estate, I actually call it farm, fire and immigration. Where does the insurance part of fire come in? Well, we have a perverse contributor to the New Zealand economy in the last decade, which is known as disaster capitalism. Earthquakes. The contribution to the New Zealand economy from reconstruction of the Christchurch post-earthquakes has been hugely significant. It has also, of course, increased some of the costs of construction. Some of the shortages that have meant that we've had to import migrant workers living in conditions in Christchurch that are not good. But it's a windfall in GDP terms. So if we strip out that windfall, the structural fragility of the New Zealand economy becomes even clearer. Then let's look at the immigration side, farm, fire and immigration. One of the reasons the government has wanted to keep bringing people in is to boost demand and boost consumption and keep the economy going. Cut off immigration, just like no more earthquakes or no more floods, then the economy takes a hit. But it carries with it more morbid symptoms, as we see only too clearly in Auckland. Now let's remember why all of this matters. It matters because of its impact on people, the inequalities, the instabilities, the insecurities, the sense that people are alienated from decision-making processes, that they engage in spectator democracy, and a growing sense that we don't actually have alternatives to what there is now, so let's just keep the bicycle moving forward. Now, I said that this is not sustainable and we need to make change before a crisis occurs. In the book, I identify 6 things that need to change. The first is that there needs to be a new economic model that is based on real, sustainable, job-creating economic activity, not using the word growth, that can deal with the challenges of climate change, that can deal with the challenges of energy depletion, that can deal with the skill shortages that we have now and actually invest in training in people, that create long-term relationships between people who are employed and those they are employed by. And there is some work that is happening on that in different parts of the world. But we have a very shallow economic, intellectual base in this country. It has largely got stripped out. We don't even teach economic history in most of our universities. And because we don't teach history, people don't realise that economic paradigms have changed in the past. Economic paradigms have a lifespan and then they're replaced by another. And we are not engaging with what that will look like. And I'm not an economist, despite the fact I spent most of the time talking about the economy. But there are some here, and there are some internationally, and there are some returning home who are looking at these issues. Yeah? And so there needs to be fostering of that, but a willingness at the same time to recognise that maybe we can't keep living the consumer-driven dream that we have been. The second that I point to is the need to build momentum around a different value base. That there needs to be a value-based and ethical platform which replaces some of that offensive, greed-driven, individualist agenda of the past. And the reason I'm looking through my notes is that there was a lovely piece that a tax QC called Tony Malloy, who's a good Catholic, wrote in a submission to the Select Committee when it was looking at what to do after the finance company collapses. Now, those finance companies were terrible things. Talk about an ethical void. And the fact that most of them haven't been held to account. And now we've changed the law, not to tighten it up, but to make sure that directors aren't criminally liable in most instances. But Tony Malloy identified a crying need for culture change, to reverse what he called the culture of the New Zealand market that has treated investors as prey, rather than as fellow citizens engaged in an enterprise from which all might profit to the benefit of the nation as a whole. Now, my dad's day, for all the faults that there were, a very constipated kind of economy and political system, there was that kind of value system. Yeah? It was monocultural. It was patriarchal, but it had a basis for values that could have been built on. So what are the ways that we rebuild solidarity, balance, social protection into our thinking as a nation? The third is that we need to rethink what we want from the state. Not simply try to resurrect what was before, because that wasn't actually all so great. It wasn't capable and benign in the way that we might romanticize sometimes. And yes, there are things that, not so much the market, but people and communities can and should do rather than the state. It's the culture and the institutional techniques that are used to achieve that are problematic, and we need to rethink what it is that we want from the state. The fourth element is that we need to, and this is where the lawyer bit in me comes in, reframe the policy and regulatory frameworks that were so carefully constructed from the mid-1980s to the early 1990s. And this was not a conspiracy theory by the critics. It was a conspiracy by those who did it. As part of the research for the book, I read a book by Murray Horn, who was a Secretary to the Treasury after Graham Scott. And in the name of institutional economics, he explained the structures that were necessary to put in place for monetary policy, for fiscal policy, for public finance, for state-owned enterprises that would deal with what were variously called the commitment problem. That governments might decide this wasn't so good after all, they might want to change it. So let's set the structures in place that are very difficult to change and put the fire alarms in place and normalise, make normative things like fiscal responsibility, sound monetary policy, independent central banks. Best practice regulation, which actually means light-handed, risk-tolerant regulation of the kind that brought us Pike River, the financial company collapses, the rest home problems, the forestry deaths, and so on. This was consciously constructed, and New Zealand went further than any other country in doing so, using contract as a basis for doing it. If we are to change into a post-neoliberal era, we actually need to change those invisible structures of the state. And that's the job for some of us. Then we need to have political will to embark on such change by political parties that are now deeply committed to the norm of what has been put in place for the last 30 to 40 years. And opposition parties that are terrified about suggesting alternatives because of the way the media and the investors and the think tanks will respond. So what are they going to do when we hit the cliff? Which brings us to the question, the sixth of them, which is where I'm going to wind up. We need to have popular demand for change that will create that political will. Political parties will only move when the climate is there for them to move. And there needs to be a sense of urgency in doing so. And in my paper, I was thinking about some really positives because I've been quite negative. And there are three kind of positives that immediately came to mind that reflect the Quaker values of solidarity, truth, integrity, care for the planet, and social justice. The first was, if you think about the homelessness crisis in winter last year, who was it who stepped in? It was Tupuia Marae. The values of manaakitanga, whanaungatanga, the value structures that are fundamental to our society, even if they are not recognised by a large bulk of the society. And they showed that a treaty-based approach to each other is actually not just good for Māori, but good for everybody. We saw the same with the Edgecombe floods. We saw the same with the Kaikoura earthquake. So we have this infrastructure. The second example is a very Auckland-specific one, but I'm sure that it's happening in other places. Laira Hare bought a restaurant in Auckland called Eka and started to hold salons. There would be political debate events, often 2 or 3 times a week, where people could come and actually have a place to engage and discuss not just the problems of the day, but what alternatives might look like. And it's not that difficult for those kind of spaces to be created, especially in smaller places. brings me back to my beloved publisher, Bridget Williams. Whilst our news media has largely gone to the dogs in terms of mainstream media, and I'm not a huge fan of blogs because they're not that well moderated and people kind of preach to the self-converted. What Bridget set out to do, following stuff she's always done in her career, was to develop a new means of communication. So she's developed little ebooks, and I'm meant to bring some, but they're a little bit thicker than this. You can read them in an hour and a half.
God, I can't.
So for people who don't want to wade through things like my big long tomes, these are really exciting new digital first spaces, but also available in hard copy. And there's some of us oldies, Prue has one, I have one, Mike Joy has one on water and so on. But she has been consciously bringing new generations, the younger ones, in to give them voice. And so journalist and trade unionist Morgan Godfrey has one about the interregnum that I was talking about, rethinking New Zealand. We have Max Rashbrook, who's been leading discussions around inequality, and not just in the book, but holding talks throughout the country and holding discussions in different parts of the country. So taking the debate to people and trying to generate the discussion. There is a really great one, which I'm going to use for my students, by Andrew Dean, who's a young man who wrote a book, a little one, called Ruth, Roger and Me, Debts and Legacies, about what it was like to be a child of neoliberalism and trying to understand neoliberalism from when you lived within it. And his hope for the future rests around the values of Aroha. And then most recently, although this isn't a little one, but it gives me enormous hope, is that these young people are taking on the role of the new generation public intellectuals. And there's a young man called Max Harris, who's one of our graduates. You may have heard him on the radio and elsewhere. He got this incredibly prestigious fellowship at All Souls College in Oxford. And to write whatever he wanted for 5 years. And he has written this book called The New Zealand Project. He's about to give the Michael King Memorial Lecture on a new politics for New Zealand. And he is talking about a new principles-based approach to the future for his generation. A values-based politics, a politics grounded in progressive values of care, community, and creativity. A rejuvenated role for the state in the economy and social policy within a broader society that is decolonised, the need for the state to be driven by genuine people power, the need to define these values. And the core claim of the book, according to him, is the need for his generation to create this new way forward. And so I think if we can nurture them, give them the space, the new generation of public intellectuals are actually going to fill the interregnum. I just hope that they are going to fill it soon enough. Joy.
We'll just take a couple of minutes of silence as we do in Quakers and just reflect on Jane's lecture, and then we'll open the floor for questions and comments. Thank you.